Okay, yesterday we had a terrific discussion that involved Charlie Cogbill, Neil Pederson, and Bill Keaton. And in that talk, a number of times Neil referred to a study that he and Dave Orwig are conducting. It's examining old-growth forests across the eastern U.S., including looking in a detailed way at their histories, the age structure, and dynamics as reflected through tree rings. We invited Neil and Dave to present on that work and other insights that they have on old growth. So this is going to be an opportunity to really get in a detailed way, looking at the actual science and data that's emerging from our existing stands. Let me just tell one anecdote about Dave Orwig, which I love telling. So I was involved in hiring Dave to come to New England from Penn State University, where he's just finishing a PhD. And I was interested in starting a program that would look at hemlock forests and the emerging dynamics of the hemlock woolly adelgid. And this was at a time when the adelgid had just entered Connecticut. And I envisioned, and many people were starting to envision exactly what's happened, which is that it spread and we'd gradually see the dissolution of some of our most beautiful hemlock forests. And so Dave was hired as a postdoc. He's been at the Harvard Forest ever since. He came with just this incredible background, and most relevant to this meeting, that background included studying old-growth forests. But the anecdote that I love to share is that, you hire a postdoc and you're always worried, will they be able to tackle the new project, and will they be able to make that transition from finishing a PhD to diving into this new world that they're involved in. And the biggest challenge is the fact that they bring this huge thesis that they're now trying to convert into papers. And of course, your interest is to get them going by publishing, making sure that everything is out the door and so on, and new things are into the works as they're writing grant proposals and everything else. So one of my first questions to Dave was, well, okay, so what's the status of that PhD thesis you just finished? And he said, yeah. He said, there are 5 manuscripts, and I'm just submitting the last one. All the rest are in process, and they're all getting published. So Dave is somebody who not only brings great strengths and a great breadth of capability, he's somebody who gets things done. I love it. Dave Orwig.
Thanks very much for that. It's been a pleasure working with David over all those years. I guess I would say the one advantage I had is that in addition to studying hemlock woolly adelgid, he allowed me to study those old-growth forests in the meantime. So it was reciprocal. So I want to thank David and Liz and everybody else for this meeting. I love coming to the old-growth meetings. I first started coming back in 1997 at that Clarion meeting. I presented on a newly rediscovered old-growth forest that I did work with Charlie and David on Wachusett Mountain. And so that was kind of, 30 years ago almost. So I've been coming trying to ever since. And so old growth has always been a passion of mine. I did a lot of studies in grad school, but that wasn't what my thesis was on. It was extra stuff. And so I had the ability and the fortunate circumstances to study a lot of those forests. And so, this is me and Neil Pederson. I'm up here giving the talk. This is all of our work together. This is a labor of love that we've been doing for many, many years. Neil and I have worked together for almost 30 years ourselves. And I'm going to give you a few warnings. There might be some science in this. There might be a few graphs. But there will be some cool pictures, too, and hopefully some hope as well. So, let's see. All right, so what I hope to share with you today is this big network that David alluded to, and you may have heard Neil talk about. It's this regional old growth network that we've been studying over the last 4 to 5 years. and hopefully share with you some of the attributes of these forests. We've heard a lot about the variation, and you're going to see a lot of variation that we have found. Mostly using our new data. When appropriate, I'll throw in a few things from past work as well. The data we've collected for this is basically complete, meaning all the tree cores we collected have been processed. Now the in-depth analysis begins. And so it's not a complete story that I'm going to share with you today, but hopefully it's little tidbits, and here's where we're going to go, and this is what we think this means. And so with a big focus on age structure. Not just to show you the ages, but to show you the variability in ages that we see. So hopefully it'll cement some of the themes we've heard about in this meeting so far. I'll say just a word on sampling some of these areas. We don't hear a lot about sampling, and I have a few ideas on where we think it can be most effective in some of these both large and small areas. And of course, because I study invasive insects, there's also going to be a little bit of threats of what these places face. And then a few take-home messages. I guess I'll do this. All right, so we've heard a lot about definitions. I only have 2 cents worth on that myself. David and I wrote a paper in 1996 on temperate old-growth forests, and we cite Spies and Franklin in there. But basically, for me, it's an area that contains old trees that does not show direct evidence of human clearing or agriculture. That's it. That's all I'm going to say about definitions. I also am done with quibbling over definitions. For me, the passion for me is that it's always the portion of the landscape that I can feel connected to the past with the most. And you do feel different when you go into these areas. You sense a change. And so for me, that's what drives me. I'm thrilled I get to still keep studying these places because of all the reasons that Tom and others have talked about with the biodiversity, the morphological assemblages. I'll show you a lot of different morphology in these trees. And these basic reference conditions that we can look at old growth forests for as a basis for other either managed or semi-managed areas. And in the background of all the things going on with changing climate and introduced pests and pathogens. And I always put foremost, it's the aesthetic and spiritual values to me that really kind of stand out and have equal importance to everything else. So here's the network. This network is not an extensive network. You may be looking at these states, I know there's other places in these states. This is the network we came up with to try to maximize geography, space, and species, and I'll tell you why that is in just a minute. But currently we've looked at 29 sites, over 3,000 trees, but 2,500 cores, because some of these we had duplicate cores and things like that. And importantly, we've aged all the trees in plots. We got heights for all the trees and plots. This is kind of unprecedented, and as well as things like coarse woody debris. So this allows us to look at the structure and dynamics of these forests, gives us a nice snapshot back in time. We hired an environmental historian, Don Davis, to actually spend years actually going over not just land records, but like old gazettes and things about climatic records and storms that may have impacted these forests. And we're just getting at kind of marrying those two things together. And so this is a lot of data. It's a big region. So basically, I'll be talking about things like northern New England, the Adirondacks, and then like western New York, and then the Pennsylvania, just for like groupings for some of this. So as an example, in the Adirondacks, we were able to look at 9 sites throughout the Adirondacks. This does not mean that these are the only old growth sites in the Adirondacks, but these are the ones that we focused on primarily for just different species and geographic locations, because we're trying to create this idea of, is there spatial patterning across some of the tree responses that we see? And so we have over 700 cores from that area, 13 different species. This is a very important thing. It's not just conifers. It's the very hard to read hardwood trees as well. 9 different sites. So we have this type of information across our network. To fund a network like this, it was challenging. I mean, I want to give perseverance, and I want to tell all you people out there looking for grants, I think Neil and I submitted this 6 different times. But we knew we had a good idea, and we stuck with it, and there were different programs. And so one of the overarching hypotheses for us was we believed that a climatic extreme events would affect disturbance regimes in addition to gap phase process that we always hear about. And so we're interested in how those disturbance regimes and ecosystem development scaled from local to subcontinental scales. And so with this network, with all these trees, we can go from years to decades to centuries, from individual trees out to the landscape. And so that's just the overarching hypothesis. There's a secondary one about how do these climatic events impact ecological processes. This is more of a modeling exercise that I'm not going to say anything more about because we haven't done it yet. This is going to be in the future using dynamic vegetation models where we can actually input some of what we find from tree rings into these models and then see what that means for things like ecological processes. So enough about the modeling part, but this was kind of how we were able to kind of fund this and get it going long term. In terms of sampling, fairly simple sampling strategy in the sense that we go out there and we set up these permanent plots. And in the case that we use were circular plots. We had basically a 20-meter radius plot. So anything that was 30 centimeters or greater in size, we cored, and we got an XY coordinate for it. Anything smaller, we measured in a smaller nest at 7 meters. And we made this trade-off decision because we could have sampled all the small stems in that plot, but we'd probably get 15 sites done. They'd take way too much longer to core 60 small red maple and 60 small beech. We made that decision, and I believe it has paid off. I'll show you some caveats of that, but it worked out really well for us. We take at least one to two cores per tree. Usually one, but sometimes we would take 2 cores per tree because if they're really big and they're diffuse porous, we might need 2 to get the actual cross dating. We also did coarse woody debris along transects within the same plot. And we would do 1 to 3 plots per site. I'll show you the ones that had smaller sampling. We could only put in 1 plot, but we tried to do 3 when we could. And in addition to that, we also would core trees out of plot. And this becomes very important down the line, as I'll explain to you. Okay, and then again, for those of you not in New England or maybe not knowing about all the different species, broadly speaking, we can think about those 4 regions that I'll talk about. In terms of northern New England, we can think about those more as yellow birch, sugar maple with some red spruce and fir. That was a pretty constant theme. Western New York is hemlock, northern hardwoods. We also had some oak sites, some pine sites kind of mixed in. Adirondacks were definitely clearly classical hemlock, white pine, northern hardwoods, and spruce. And in Pennsylvania, we had a series of different types of sites, from black gum swamp to the classic Cook forest, to the Cook forest hardwoods and things like that. So a combination of things. And again, I'm not going to show you a bunch of tables. This is just as an example. So for each of these sites, we have things like, standing basal area. We have dead basal area. I don't want you to see these numbers, just to know that we have things like the density of stems, the dead stem density. And so for each one of these sites, we've started to compile this together. And so the first snapshot I can give you of things like that would be the range in basal area that we see. So again, we think about these western examples. They're so huge trees. In the east, we have, really large trees in some of our sites, and then really not too dense or small trees in some of these other sites. So the blue dots are our black swan, our current network. I thought it'd be nice to place them into context of other studies that Bill Keaton, Greg McGee, and Tony D'Amato's done for a Northeastern Old Growth Forest. And so we span the range. We have 5 sites with like 30 square meters of basal area or less. They're still old. You would not go out to that forest maybe and recognize them as being old. And this is important. There's this wide range in variability. Conversely, we have 2 that are at the top. Things like Cook Forest, Pack Forest. They pack in with very large stems. So we're starting to get some idea of this is a very diverse network. All right? A little bit just on the size distribution. This is a graph for 9 sites in the Adirondacks, and this is the count number of stems in the plot by diameter class, and the colors correspond to species. And so there's a lot on these graphs. I'm just going to try to give you a few tidbits about each one, but I only show one size distribution here. So for example, we can take this Chase Fen esker. There's a lot of stems, pine stems here in the 40 to 50 to 60 centimeter diameter. This is a red pine, white pine site on an esker that had past fire history. We have other sites where we have large tails in the diameters over 100 centimeters, or up to 90 centimeters of white pine, hemlock, and we have a lot of big yellow birch as well. You saw that picture last night with Chris Kane at Sunapee. We have a lot of these in the landscape. I mean, at one point in my notebook, I had said, every 100 feet or so, there's a 70-centimeter yellow birch in this landscape, and they're everywhere. What's missing from that landscape is beech of that size. So if you look at the gray bars here, that's beech. Now we have some in the 40-centimeter, 50-centimeter range. Once in a while, we'll get a big one. We should be seeing a lot more. They are gone from the vast majority of the landscape already. To the point where Neil and I recognized some forests that just didn't look right because they are not there, and they should be there. For those of you who really get into the nitty-gritty about size distributions and old growth, you may be saying, I thought they were supposed to be like reverse J shape, right? Well, they kind of are resembling that. But keep in mind, we had this sampling caveat where we only sampled the small stems in a small nest. And so this is not the complete picture. However, I have a few stands where we have done that. We've done the entire size class, and they give us this nice reverse J. So this is our only limitation from that sampling regime, but it suffices to say it's adequate. Okay. So we've heard a lot about things that are in old growth or may not be in old growth, and I always view these things as, well, they might be there. They might not be there, and that's critical. Early definitions, they had to have so much basal area and so many tip-up mounds and had to have coarse woody debris. No. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. What we do often see, if you have trees that are there for centuries, they are beat-up trees. They don't move around, right? So somewhere in 300 years, you're going to experience a storm lightning something, and so we have a lot of standing dead trees. We have beat-up crowns. As many have mentioned, the bark is completely different as you start to age. And in fact, sometimes that bark can change 3 or 4 times over different 50 or 100-year periods. Downwoody debris, well, sometimes you have a lot. Sometimes you almost have none. That is not a good indicator for me for old-growth forest. Tip-up mounds, maybe. Depends on the species. If you have a small-statured forest, you're not going to blow down. You're not going to create a tip-up mound. That doesn't mean it's not old-growth forest. So anyway, enough on that. Suffice to say, structurally complex. All right, I'll give you some pictures. Mix it in here. Clearly, the things that we are out looking for are things like damaged trees, gnarled crowns. Tom said, candelabra trees. We're always looking for those because to us, that means great age, almost always. These trees that just bend out into the landscape, these are classic old trees. This tree, incidentally, is at Ricketts Glen State Park. It is 20 feet off a parking lot, and that's 250 years old. That's a chestnut oak, actually. And we get these other things. This is up in the Adirondacks, this really kind of superficial candelabra-style birch tree. These things that have kind of rebent themselves 4 or 5 times, definitely old. So we love seeing things like that, these beat-up trees. Here's other examples. This is actually a site in northern Maine that had these beat-up crowns that were still in the canopy, and this is just so classic. We love this. The top is gone. New stems have taken over the branches, and then we get this gnarled stem. So this is like a 250-year-old chestnut oak in western New York State. And most of the forests that we sampled had trees like that in it. So when you see things like this, they're almost always old. And of course, again, standing snags. They're everywhere in a lot of these old forests. But again, in most of the places that we had, this is what we saw for big beech. Dead big beech. Or down on the ground big beech. Or down on the ground and half rotted away big beech. They're just not there. Okay, bark. All kinds of different bark characteristics. This is from Cook Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. I had to put Charlie in a figure here. So this is a big yellow birch up in Lafayette Brook in New Hampshire. And I had no idea snakes could climb trees. Have you ever seen a snake do this? I just couldn't believe it. This is a big sugar maple in Ricketts Glen. And there it went. I just had no idea. Okay. As I said, they reach all kinds of different morphologies in some of these forests. So anyone know what this one is? Any guess? So this is a black gum tree where the big plates have mostly sloughed off. And so you're left with that smooth bark again.
How old was that tree?
I don't know off the top of my head. This was a site in Bear Swamp. Those were at least 400 years old. They were also rotten. This is a chestnut oak tree that was over 200 years old. Again, in Ricketts Glen, this is a red oak tree where the big plates have kind of sloughed off. And so we see all kinds of things like this as we go into these forests. You also get these amazing bryophytes, loberia and other things. So this is a tree in the Adirondacks, and this is a tree, I believe, in northern Maine. But anyway, so when they're there for centuries, you have all kinds of different microenvironments that some of these trees can create or provide as habitat. Just a few more here. Any guesses on this one? What that might be?
Cherry?
It is cherry. Very good, black cherry. And so that all those plates are basically gone on this. How about this one? And this is yellow birch, believe it or not. It's kind of crazy how they take on different forms. And I don't know if you can see this, it's a little bit shady. Any thoughts on this one? It is a red maple. We'll hear more about this red maple later. This is the oldest known red maple. 360. You'll hear more about it later. So, some pictures of some of the different types of morphologies we can get at. So, there's also the down woody material, right? I said sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. So once again, I looked at our network of sites, which are represented by the blue dots, and this is in the coarse woody debris volume. And the orange dots are from previous studies published in this region by people at this conference. And we did have a few anomalies, actually, but most of them were kind of in that 100 cubic meters. But we have a wide range again. Some have really low coarse wood. And then we have these monster coarse wood areas. That monster was Cook Forest. And so, and again, if we had sampled this maybe 30 years ago, we probably wouldn't have that, because these just fell in the last 10 years. So at our place in time, there's a lot there, and there's a really high volume right there. But it made it really hard to actually walk around in this plot. So it depends on when you go, what the species and forest types are as well. But everywhere we go, we have different types of coarse wood. Some are even forming like these nurse logs up in Mount Abraham, and then in Pollywog Pond, we have all kinds of conifers in particular. The hardwood coarse woody debris really does decompose really quickly, and we just don't see that much in a lot of those forests. Okay, and just to point out, so all the forests that we looked at in our network, we didn't have like adjacent second growth forests that we also looked at. We didn't have time to do that. But Tony D'Amato has done that in old growth hemlock forests, where he looked at 18 hemlock old growth forests in Massachusetts and then the adjacent hemlock second growth forests. And to no one's surprise, the amount of coarse woody debris volume is so much higher in our old growth hemlock forests at various stages of decay than second growth. And so that's really one of the big things that's missing from second growth forests, is a lot of coarse woody debris. So we weren't able to do it in this study, but Tony was able to show that, old growth forests definitely have a lot more carbon, a lot more down woody debris. And this goes along with other estimates. In at least temperate forests, where old growth stores more carbon, we haven't calculated the biomass yet. We're going to. So we'll put our own values onto this. But, for example, Keaton showed like 270 versus 200 essentially, old growth versus second growth. McGarvey and others in the mid-Atlantic also show higher in old growth versus second growth. We'll be able to contribute to that. Again, sometimes when these huge trees fall over, they create these amazing legacies. And Tom, that's the one slide I had to scan and turn into a digital image, because this is from 1990. I was a young grad student studying Cook Forest for the first time, and this is one tree's tip-up mound, which is over twice my height. And anyway, so we do see these really kind of strange features on the landscape that aren't there in second growth forests, where these big stumps will take place and then new things start on top of it. So anyway, just some fun pictures of some of that. Many of them are on steep slopes, okay? It's no surprise that if you're on a steep slope and you're not very tall, you're not gonna be that economically valuable. They're not really gonna go cut you, sometimes. And so a lot of the sites that we looked at were on steep slopes. And so here's some views of some of these forests down a steep slope at Zoar Valley, or Big Slide in the Catskills, Lafayette Brook. Actually, Charlie helped us on that day. And then Lebo Pine. Again, if you look through that forest, does that look really big and old to you? It is, though. It's not very big, but it's definitely old. And so a lot of these are on steep terrain, but not all of them. Here we see this really steep slope of Mount Abraham that was really hard to get down. But then we have these just glorious sites like Gold Mine that's just flat, easy to walk through. You take a little trail down and you're there. It almost feels like, is this really right? It seems too easy to get here. This can't be right. But this was an amazing forest, Gold Mine, New York. One thing I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but we do have the information again, is the height data. And so we know that these forests are usually pretty complex. We know that they're sometimes tall, but sometimes not that tall. And so Eric Danielson is going to be talking a little bit about that height information today in a talk here later this afternoon. But again, if you're using remote sensing only as a height measure, you're going to miss a lot of old growth. So I'm positive others are doing this, but you got to look at other things in that remote sensing, things like rugosity and canopy roughness and things like that. Oh yeah, I forgot. This had animation. But this is one of our STEM map plots that we can then differentiate by species and diameter class and by height. So we're just beginning to start thinking about that type of situation. And of course, age, right? It's like Bob said, it's one thing to know that there's old growth there. To document it is something clearly different and much more time consuming, I might add. And so we did it the old-fashioned way many times, which is coring by hand, but we did get these kind of fancy drills that helped us in some of our forests get through some of these large trees. They didn't help too much getting them out. So we still had to really kind of turn them to get them, but they definitely helped getting them in a lot of places. And of course, in the old time, we would just like measure them on a Velmec system. We take these tree rings back, we put them in wooden mounts, we polish, and then we were able to measure them. Now we have this really fancy video system where we can take these digital images, and then they're just as good as a microscope. Because when I was in grad school, you increased the magnification on a scanned image, it was just pixels. You couldn't see anything. Now you can see you can see vessel size, you can see all kinds of things. So this is a beech, and this is an oak. And so then the other thing that allows, is that you then have these images for posterity. It's one thing for me to say, hey, but now I can share the image with Bob or somebody, say, look, this is what the tree is. Anyway, so we now have the ability to examine all these tree rings. These are a combination of cores from one site. The yellow and blue bars just indicate a decade in time from 1750 to 1760, for example, in this case. And these are the oaks that are really narrow rings, and then they increase. Narrow rings, and then they release. And then hemlocks, same thing, narrow rings, and then they release. And so, again, it took a dedicated team. We have an amazing team that worked on this project. It took us 3 years nonstop, 12 months out of the year, to get to the point where we've now measured all these cores. So, and it's not just measuring them, it's also then cross-dating them. And what I mean by cross-dating them, like I can count that and say, oh, that's 50 years, but maybe it has a missing ring. And trees form missing rings a lot. And so by cross-dating, looking at a ton of cores and running it through different software, you can determine whether you have missing rings or not. And many of our sugar maple and birch had missing rings. Some had 10 missing rings. So I don't want to scare people off from doing hardwoods. You should still keep doing hardwoods. But to accurately date them and cross-date them, it takes a long time. And so we've finally gotten to that point, and now we can then start piecing all this stuff together. And I'll say a little bit more about the tree rings here in a minute. But so again, it's no surprise. I've been telling you the variation that exists out there. These are some of the views. We do have really big trees as well. But then we have forests like this that at a first glance, you're like, what is that? That's actually an old forest in Allegheny, or Western New York, that has old sugar maple in it. And to our knowledge, it is an old growth forest. There's no evidence to suggest otherwise, and there's no records, and the ages bear it out. This tree, this is Ed Cook. Ed Cook was instrumental in helping us find the really old hemlocks. This tree is over 400 years old. So these trees are not very big, but they're really old. Okay, a little bit about the ages. I am going to give you a few graphs because I think it's important. I want to show you what we actually have out there. In addition to me just telling you ages, I can show you the ages. And so these are inner rings or establishment dates by species, the number of trees over these different locations. So for example, this is the New England sites, northern New England. The purple bar is red spruce. So we see at a couple of these different sites. Mount Abraham, we have spruce that came established around 1800, just after 1800, and in the 1900s. We see the same thing in Lafayette Brook. We see the same thing in Little Moose Mountain up in Maine. And so we start to see these differences among species, then some similarities. You know, in this case, the red bars are sugar maple. Sugar maples, they have wide-ranging ages across these sites. And so we're starting to compile this for all of our locations. These are not scaled yet to per hectare. These are just the counts that we have within our plots. So we have big birch, or old maple in these forests. And so, for example, we can move on to another location. These Pennsylvania sites, this is not Tionesta, but these are other sites that we had in Pennsylvania and this bear swamp in New Jersey. This is Cook Forest. This is what many people hold up as this is the old growth forest quintessential, right? It has old hemlock, white pine. We've already lost a bunch of this old hemlock and white pine, and yet the age structure is still off the charts, where we have 300-year-old plus a 325 hemlock and white pine. Just basically down the road from this is an oak-dominated forest in Cook Forest, where it has chestnut oak, and this blue bar in this case is white oak. So we have a lot of oaks that established back 300 years ago. All right? Old growth to me has nothing to do with successional status, because then what, you wouldn't call this oak forest an old growth forest? Because they're not late successional? I mean, so anyway, we have really nice trees here at Cook Forest. Ricketts Glen has a lot of old hemlock, white pine. We've lost a lot of hemlock in there too. And I'll give both state forests in Pennsylvania a lot of credit. They're trying to treat their hemlock. They've kept a bunch alive to at least allow us to see what these age structures are. We don't know what we've lost already, but it's coming, unfortunately. Lebo pine, that's another red pine site. This we know has documented fire on the site. There's red pine scars everywhere. Mike Stambo has shown fire scar histories from stumps on this back to the 1300s. This is an old forest with 250-year-old red pine. Two more. The western, these are small pockets of old growth. I thought I also want to share, because they're just as important as these large landscape old growth patches as well. And they're all a little bit different. We could only do one plot at these because they weren't big sites, but we were still able to get great ages from them. So we have like I think a 500-year-old hemlock in Canada Way. We have old hemlock at Giant Ledge. These are the two Catskill sites right here. And in this case, green is also sugar maple, the light green. So we have old sugar maple birch on these sites. This is the only site we had old beech still. This is in Ohio. And these are tremendous beech. Actually, there's a picture of one here. But these all have beech leaf now. So I don't hold out much hope for them. It was shocking to see that they had survived beech bark. And then when we were there, they had no crown. It's like, this does not look good. Zor. Incredible old hemlocks on these slopes in Zor Valley. Just tremendous. And again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I did want to share. And this is that the chestnut oak site. A lot of oaks became established. So again, we can get great ages even from small patches. It doesn't have to be a huge patch. One more. These are their Adirondacks. These are really kind of amazing sites with tremendous ages. You know, we see frequent establishment of species, really old hemlocks in a lot of these sites. Again, this is that red pine area in the Adirondacks. And they all date to around the same time, early 1800s. I'll say a little bit more about some of these sites in just a second. And then I want to show you this one. This is Tionesta Forest, very low diversity, hemlock dominated, right? We only have a few other species in there. But then I want to look at these dates. We have an establishment date in the 1300s of living hemlock. This is the oldest known red maple at 362. And I got to give Eric Danielson credit. He was working with us, helping us sample. At that time, he lived not too far away. He was able to do some additional scouting around, and that enabled us to better refine what we have on the landscape. And it's really quite remarkable. I've never seen a forest like this. And so I told you we have XY coordinates. And so we can start looking at this data in different ways. These are just the 2 plots that we looked at Goldmine. These are the stem maps where the different species exist within that plot, and then the innermost age that we have for those stems. And what I like about showing both of these plots is that, sometimes I think we naively think, well, we're going to walk through this old forest and they're all going to be old, or only 1 or 2 are going to be old. Well, so this plot had 18 stems over 200 years old. And this had 5 or 6, but they still had older stems in it. And so it does show you that in these landscapes, again, you have a mosaic. You have old trees throughout, but sometimes they're much more concentrated in certain areas over others. This is an amazing forest. One more of these. This is Tyanesta. These are the 3 forest plots we looked at. And I want you to look at some of these establishment dates. 1530. 1534, 1509, 1437, 1365. Again, this is just the same 20 by 20 meter plot. So for eastern forests, I'm just telling you, this is highly unusual, and it's amazing. They don't have a delgid yet. I don't know when that'll be. So overall on this site, we had 42 hemlocks over 300 years old, 25 over 400. So we've been lucky to really kind of document some of these sites. Just a quick side note, when I asked for permission to sample Tyanesta, they said no. I said, well, I had no idea it was going to be this old. I said, well, we're going to lose all the information from these trees because they're going to be killed off by a delgid coming. And then they changed their mind. They let us sample there because we never would have had this opportunity without that permission. All right, we'll switch on to, all right, here's a picture of one of our hemlock forests. So what do people think? Does that look old to you? Looks pretty old? How many think it's old? Anybody think it's young? Just curious. Yeah, it is kind of a trick question. Okay, these are the ages. So this is that Tyanesta plot. So this is one portion of a plot that is about the size of this room. And these are the ages just in that one portion. And so it's really quite remarkable. And we have these just amazing forests still out there. And I encourage people to keep studying, keep looking, keep documenting. So when we have trees like this and elsewhere around the network, again, the team has done this amazing work of cross-dating these trees. We can now start to get precise histories of these trees. The trees are telling us information. I love to hear their stories. I mean, every tree we core is a gift, right? They're telling us information. We get to learn about how they grew, and especially over time. So because of this, we can start, this is just one tree core. This is just the radial growth over time. And I thought, why not show the oldest one? So this is that 1300 establishment date hemlock. Well, you can see it still has these huge increases in radial growth at different times in its lifespan. In this case, it showed a release in the 1500s and the 1700s. We can start using that information to start looking across other trees in that forest. These are 4 cores that we have, actually also from Tyanesta. And I literally chose 4 at random. They happen to be close to each other, but they're all showing this sharp dip and then a huge increase at around 1915. All right, so with our historical data and other things, we can start to attribute these events to known events and see how damaging was that to the forest? How widespread was it? Was it just certain species of trees? Was it big trees, small trees, other species? So we can start to look at that. We can look at how they grew sharply and how they decreased maybe due to storms. So we can start pulling all this together. We can start looking for synchronicity. And so this is one site in the Adirondacks. This is the number of trees that we cored over time. So this is kind of like the sampling depth. And the bars here represent the percentage of trees that experience sharp releases, which are indicative of disturbance. And so we see these periods here like the 1850s that have a lot of trees that experienced release or damage or disturbance. And so again, we can start at the tree level, stand level like this, and we can start expanding across the network because we're interested in like, well, okay, does this peak that we see in the gold mine site, is that seen elsewhere in the Adirondacks? Maybe it's in all 9 sites. We're going to start looking at that. And so we can start looking at that. Equally important to us are these quiet periods where no trees show any evidence of disturbance. That's equally interesting and important. And is that due to climate? Is it due to some other things going on in the stand? So that's what we're going to be looking at next. All right. This just came in last week. It's our first glimpse at trying to do what I just said, scale across the network. So this is 2,500 trees, looking at the percentage of those trees that show a sharp increase in radial growth. And so the average in any given year is about 1%. But we have these periods again of pretty high percentage of trees exhibiting a release and these really interesting quiet periods at times that we wouldn't think of. 1900s, there's no better evidence that these are like old growth forests. I mean, there's a lot of cutting during this time, and yet we have some of these quiet periods that did not exhibit any type of disturbance. So we don't have the answer to this. I'm just saying this is ongoing. It's a first glimpse. These are the types of things we're going to be looking at. Are these peaks heavily weighted by one region or not? We don't know. We're going to be looking at that. All right. The reason we're doing this, we have seen evidence like this before. So we've seen synchronous increases in radial growth across species in different states in the southeastern United States. And this is why we keep pursuing it here in the Northeast. But these are just 4 different oak species and hemlock from 3 different states, all showed a sharp increase in radial growth at the same time. And in this case, it was due to frost and drought event. And so we think that we may be starting to see evidence of that here in this network, for example. Okay, next steps. You can also do things like if you know the species of the trees and the amount of trees being released, you can then create ideas about amount of canopy disturbed based on equations you can put in there. So we could get things like amount of canopy disturbance. Tony has done that for a lot of hemlock sites in Massachusetts, and so he found that the biggest decade of canopy disturbance had like 25%, 26%. We can start looking at that in this network. Okay, back to ages. I find it really interesting to start looking at, well, across those different sites, are we seeing any trends or differences among the oldest trees that we saw in this network? And, if we go up to, northern New England, for example, our oldest hemlock was 350. And again, that was pretty far up in Maine, which I found quite remarkable. And then yet, in most other places, we're seeing hemlocks reach at least 500 years old. So they're still going great on the landscape. Sugar maple, to me, is always an enigma. I always thought we'd find like 400-year-old sugar maples. We do not find those. And some of that's because they rot. Some of it's because I don't think we know that much about sugar maple. I think they grow faster than we give them credit for, and our radial growth is showing us that. And so I still think we have a lot to learn about a lot of these different species. Beech, fortunately, we still have some on the landscape. They are disappearing. So I'm thrilled we were able to document what we have now before they're gone, honestly. And things like yellow birch, sugar maple, we're reaching new heights in a lot of these because they're really hard to accurately cross-date. And then just the Adirondack sites as well. Just literally an amazing set of forests, especially with the yellow birch. We have all kinds of really impressive ages. The oldest known white ash, ironically, is from the Adirondacks. We happen to sample it. It's 312 years old. So we're seeing...
I think the oldest ever found.
Correct. That's right. So we're getting all kinds of neat finds, suffice it to say. And that just gets me back to Wachusett Mountain, that, this is a forest that was in central Mass on an isolated hill that had 700,000 visitors a year. Kind of went unnoticed. And yet, right up from the parking lot, you can see a telephone pole there. This is a almost 400-year-old yellow birch, and these are the 350-year-old red oaks. And so I encourage people to keep looking for old growth, even in unusual places, because they do exist. Okay. One word on sampling. Of course, you always want to do as much sampling as you can. We were limited sometimes to hey, we have one day. We got to get in, get out. And sometimes you're limited to how many cores you can take. But if you are limitless or have some flexibility, it's great to do plot level sampling because you can scale those values to a per hectare and do out of plot sampling. So I put two graphs together. You can't see the colors real well, but these are ages that we determined from in-plot trees, those circular plots that we did, and these are the ages from the out-of-plot trees. So in this case, at Zoar Valley, we extended our disturbance history by 200 years by doing out-of-plot trees. In this case, it's another great example. I just chose one at random, Harriet Hollister. It's one of those small sites. It allowed us to really embellish or more closely refine when did those trees get established. So if we had just done in-plot tree, we had one tree established in the 1700s early, and now we have like 7. So it's a little more indicative of what was going on in that greater landscape. So if you could do plots and out-of-plot trees, you should do it. All right, and then I have to say a little bit about invasive insects, just because for me the striking thing was how many of our sites that we looked at were being decimated by invasive pests. So this is a hemlock that had died in Cook Forest due to hemlock woolly adelgid. And of course there's a proliferation of pests across our landscape. And in particular, for us, the biggies are beech leaf disease, white ash, and beech bark disease, in addition to the hemlock woolly adelgid. And so all 4 of these are wreaking havoc almost simultaneously in these forests. Keeping in mind that historically, we also lost some elm, we lost some chestnut, and so this is going to be a kind of recurring battle. And so they escape the axe, they escape, the plow, they won't escape these. And so Pennsylvania, for example, are treating trees, which is fantastic. Is that a long-term fix? Maybe not, but it still allows those trees to survive on the landscape. It might buy time until something else can come by and help maybe try to protect some of these trees. So in the future, if we go into a forest state with 5 species and you lose 4 of them, what is that going to look like? I don't know what you call those. We're going to see. If you just lose 1 species, it makes sense. You lose 2, looking a little weird. You start losing more than that, it's a whole different situation. So we've certainly studied one forest that had lost 3 species already. And so unfortunately, that's where we are in the world, unfortunately. So I'm grateful to study these when we did. So we still have these amazing sites that exist across the landscape, protected mostly by either severe topography or by land disputes, as we've heard. Yep. And we think they've been excluded from cutting. We know they've been excluded because the radial growth would tell us that as well. And they are still largely intact. So if you can sample those trees, use plots and out of plots, we have many amazing forests, Adirondacks in particular. I wanted to highlight this. Gilbrook had 5 species over 300 years old. And so I'm just going to ask you to think about where you are in eastern North America and tell me where else you can see that. Maybe the southern Appalachians. Other than that, I don't know where you'd find it. It's really impressive. And we had other sites that had 4 species over 300. Tionesta speaks for itself. It's an outlier in an amazing way. And it goes without saying, these are not static places. They are constantly changing. They're constantly having disturbances. They're always structurally complex, at least in some level of that forest. And so we're going to continue to look at these for additional information over time. Could not be done without a team that was dedicating themselves nonstop to doing all the hard work of not only coring, processing, aging, cross-dating, imaging, and then finally getting it to be a synthesis stage. So this is the incredible team that Neil and I have had to help us over the years. I have to give them all the credit in the world. And the last thing I'll say is the permission. Many of these sites we had to kind of wrangle for a while to get permission and try to assure them, no, this is really going to be, interesting and worthwhile. And so these are some of the amazing people that gave us permission, in addition to the funding sources that we've had and the people that have helped us in the forest. And so with that, I encourage you to talk with Neil or myself.
Okay, we're going to break after this for lunch, but beforehand, we've got, I think, time for 2 questions, Okay, and how long the questions and the answers are. Yeah, Bob.
Dave, I was wondering, did you all find evidence of unusually fast growth on some of the species? I remember when Neil was coring oaks in Mohawk Trail State Forest in New York, and I'm talking about more recently, there was periods of unusually fast growth that I would not have expected otherwise. Did you see any of that?
Any other question? The question is about, did we see unusually high periods of growth? We're just getting to that stage, to be brutally honest. I mean, I can tell you that some hemlocks grew for under a half a millimeter for 300 years, and then could advance to 4 millimeters, 5 millimeters a year after that. We are seeing some of our oldest trees still growing, putting on the most wood that they put on in terms of annual ring width. So this idea that old trees don't grow well, do not believe it. It isn't true. Because we have time after time old trees that are growing the best they've ever grown after 350 years. So I'm just telling you, don't buy it.
I'll try to speak up. David, Neil, great information. Thanks for sharing that.
We're bringing you the mic. That's for the taping.
Thanks for that good information. David, you had one comment on one of your slides that caught my eye, and it was that you saw no evidence for stand replacing disturbances. And I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate on that. I found that a little bit interesting.
Yeah, so we can only go back as far as the tree rings will take us, of course. And so we don't know what happened 600 years ago, 700 years ago. The red pine stand, I guess, is the one that may have been like a stand initiating disturbance. We don't know that. But the fact that we had just continuous level of, not continuous, we had frequent periods of species establishment and not all in one big peak would suggest to me that these are not stand replacing disturbances, with the exception of the red pine forest that we saw. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but we didn't see the evidence in the data that we have yet to say that, oh, this stand started here because we see 2 stems. We just don't know that yet. So I guess that's where that comment meant. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but.
Okay, thanks very much. Sorry we don't have time for more questions, but
Talk to you later, Dan, about that.
okay. See you after lunch, 1 o'clock for contributed sessions.